Welcome back everyone. In this lesson, we are going to launch Visual Studio and start up a very simple coding project that comes with basic default code. It is this basic code into which we'll incorporate some artificial intelligence using Model Builder. Now, if you've been following along with me and you've installed and/or set up Visual Studio on your machine, you can run it so that you can see Model Builder in action for yourself a bit later on. If you have a Mac and you have not installed Visual Studio, you can still follow along with me anyway. We'll start by launching Visual Studio and setting up a new code project. And after we've gone through a couple of steps to set up our code project, we'll be able to get to the machine learning parts. In Visual Studio, the term project refers to a collection of pre-built code, files, settings, and resources that you would need to build and run a specific type of application. Visual Studio comes with project templates that are like blueprints for building something specific. For example, a web application, desktop application, or even a library that can be used by other software. In everyday language, a project usually implies something you work on to create a finished product. And that's exactly what we'll be doing inside Visual Studio. We'll be working on a project to create a software product with some AI baked into it. And as you will see later, you can group multiple coding projects together into a collection of projects called a solution. But enough of that theory, let's get on with things. I'll be running Visual Studio from inside a Windows machine. And like I said, if you are using a Mac and the Model Builder extension is not available for you, just follow along with me anyway. Launch Visual Studio by mouse-clicking on the icon on your taskbar or by searching for it as follows. Simply start typing Visual Studio and some options will appear from which you can choose. Make sure to select the Visual Studio application and not the installer application. If by accident you do select the installer application, you can still launch Visual Studio from inside the installer using this launch button over here. Once Visual Studio is started up, you will see some options to either open up recent projects here on the left or to get started on a new one. In my version of Visual Studio, my most recent projects are conveniently listed here on the left. And if you've never used Visual Studio before, you obviously won't have these options displayed here the way I do. We are going to choose to create a new code project from scratch. So click on Create New Project. After you've clicked on Create New Project, you will be presented with a list of code templates to get you started. The number and type of templates you will see here will depend on which workloads you included during your initial setup process. This is very similar to the way, for example, Microsoft Word or Excel presents you with different templates whenever you want to create a new document or a new spreadsheet. We want to keep things as simple and as code-free as possible, so we are going to create a very simple library code project. A library is just code that can't be run on its own. It is not an executable piece of code with a .exe file extension. So you can't double-click on it to start up some process the way you can double-click on an executable file, for example. On a Windows machine, a library file will typically have a .dll file extension, and the DLL stands for Dynamically Linked Library. A library is just helper code that can be used by other executable applications. So, instead of us creating an executable program, we'll create a much simpler helper library. This is because we want to focus on the machine learning process and not be distracted by complex code. So just follow along with me. In these drop-down boxes at the top, ensure that all languages, all platforms, and all project types are selected. That way you will see this enormous collection of project templates that is made available to you. Then in the search bar, type in class library. A long list of appropriate code project templates will be suggested below. You will see all kinds of templates here, including those for Windows, Android, and iOS. Find the template called class library from your list of search results and make sure to select the one that targets .NET or .NET Standard. If you don't know what a class is, don't worry about it. It won't impact your ability to follow along at all. You will see many different options for class libraries here, and explaining why we are choosing this one will just distract us. But in case you are insanely curious, .NET simply refers to Microsoft's vast suite of pre-built functionalities and code libraries that are freely available to you. It allows you to reuse pre-built code to both develop and run your applications and across platforms like Linux and Mac OS. It is not limited to Windows. The pre-built code libraries are unbelievably extensive, which means you have access to tons of code that you don't have to develop yourself from scratch. Microsoft's .NET code is also open source. And by open source, I mean it is not proprietary to Microsoft. Anyway, now that you know a little bit about the Microsoft ecosystem, select this class library and click on Next. On this screen, we need to tell Visual Studio what names to assign to our code project and solution, as well as where to save the project and related files. As I mentioned earlier, you can add multiple code projects into one solution. A solution acts like a container inside of which you can organize multiple code projects, and you can save the project to any folder of your choice. Later on, I am going to demonstrate how to incorporate machine learning into this project so that it can be used to estimate or predict the cost of medical insurance for people based on things like their age, gender, and other factors. So, with that in mind, let's give our project a suitable name. Something like Medical Cost Predictor. And you can keep the suggested solution name and click on Next. Right at the top, you need to tell Visual Studio which version of the framework you are targeting. In other words, which version of the supporting tools and code libraries in the Microsoft .NET ecosystem you want to access as you develop your code. Discussing the implications of what you choose is beyond the scope of this lesson and will just be distracting. So let's just keep things simple and select whichever version is the latest one for you. For me, the latest version is version 7, but version 8 or later might be available by the time you are watching this. Then click on the Create button. Visual Studio will now create the bare bones of your class library project. Once the process is completed, this is typically what Visual Studio will display. Just by looking at all the menu items, windows, and tabs, you can quickly get the idea that the functionality in this tool is seriously vast. At the moment, it is one of the best and most extensive IDEs out there. So trying to explain all these features right now will be kind of pointless. So for now, let's just focus on 3 of the windows in this interface. We'll start with this Solution Explorer window here on the right-hand side. The Solution Explorer window shows you how all of your code and related files are organized. Here you will see the pre-built code and the libraries that were made available to you when you created this project. Typically, the Solution Explorer window will be on the right-hand side of your Visual Studio interface, but you can change the styling. You can drag these windows anywhere it suits you. I'll just leave mine where they are for now. In this window, you can also explore and navigate all the files and projects in your solution. By default, Because we chose a class library template, Visual Studio generated an empty class file shown here at the root of your project folder, along with supporting files that you will see under this dependencies node. If you expand this dependencies node, you will see a nested file structure, along with all the .NET libraries that are made available to you based on the framework version you selected or targeted when we initially created this project. If you expand the frameworks and then the Microsoft.NET Core.app nodes, you will see all the .NET class libraries that you have access to. If you right-click on any one of those library files and select Properties from the context menu, you will be able to see the version 7 in my case, along with the actual location of the dynamically linked library file on your machine. Next, let's look at the code editor window. This is the area where you spend most of your time writing, editing, and reviewing code. It is in the central part of the IDE layout where you will see Model Builder in action. Then there is the output window. The output window serves as a real-time log console that provides insights into the operations being performed in the background. Here, you will see what data is being loaded during the machine learning process. You will see the logs of all the different training iterations, the valuation metrics, and a whole bunch of other stuff that won't mean anything to you right now. So best we move along so that we can get closer to the machine learning demo so that you can see what actually happens. I'll see you in the next lesson.